assets whose consumption can be shared through alternative ownership structures. Are applying that in the public sector. Digital contract network, this is essentially around royalty rights and royalty payments. And again, if you go to Paul Brody's LinkedIn site, you will see reference to, I think, is one of the most exciting applications of that in the gaming industry as it relates to Xbox platform for Microsoft. Maritime insurance, audit assurance, including of crypto exchanges, the public finance management one that we're going to be talking about, and intercompany one. And the thing that's common across these is that they meet each of those 5 tests. So it's typically around how do I deal with costly and often cumbersome information exchange, data, or financial and non-financial transactions across multiple parties. That's where blockchain is most powerful. At this point, that you see that not any of these got a direct cryptocurrency connection point. The way that we are applying blockchain and the way that we think is going to be most powerful really has got very, very little, if anything, to do at all with cryptocurrency. Regulatory frameworks and so forth that in the government public sector context are important as it relates to our activity in trying to use the power of blockchain. Underlying to that, but we are not dealing with cryptocurrency. Kevin. So this of blockchain for government is outlined there. Again, it is a test or a testament even in particular situations where there's an exchange of information, there's discharge of individual and collective responsibility across the interface between 2 entities. And those are essentially, that is the story of public service delivery. Interface boundaries bridge different financial and operational systems, potentially under different forms of control. Blockchain is very powerful. The context, again, as you're going to see in a moment, is particularly in the case where, let's say, that there's a public budget, but spent by an external entity to government. The ability to reconcile financial reporting, non-financial performance reporting in that context today is very, very difficult. In the future, blockchain, we think, is going to be a very powerful aid in helping to deal with that. Your point 3 there, when attaching non-financial objectives and conditions to assets. You'll see in a moment, this notion of tokenizing assets is a very powerful thing for blockchain, but more powerful is the ability to attach non-financial conditions to assets. A huge potential application in things like regulation, in things like service delivery, in things internal control structures, and so forth. The point there is that it enables reporting, integrated reporting, so that to me means financial and non-financial reporting, to any level of use or any level of disaggregation in a supply chain or a user chain or a delivery chain. And again, that's one of the things that has significant promise. The fifth point is about, and you can remember, this is, I've got lots of colleagues who are in this business, but we think there's a huge opportunity to greatly reduce the cost of audit-based compliance frameworks as they exist today. The reason is because the requirement for audit in a blockchain essentially disappears. As we conclude, I'll raise some questions about what that might mean if there are any sort of supreme audit or auditors general on the line. You might be interested in some of that. And then again, this is something really quite important from an implementation perspective, is that the blockchain technology itself is, relatively speaking, fairly simple. It is certainly less cumbersome than perhaps traditional major IMIT systems that are fraught with risk from an implementation perspective. In fact, again, as we are finding very, very quickly, one of the powers of blockchain is to be able to connect to those underlying systems without having to actually introduce costly, risky changes to those underlying systems. So the closing conclusion there is a serious one. Blockchain sounds a bit like magic. It isn't magic, but what your interest is address this sort of foundational business challenge, this sort of foundational information management, accountability, transparency challenge. Blockchain isn't going to just automatically fix it, but we think is now quickly emerging as the most powerful technology to able to actually address those. And that's where the significant promise lies. So applications, hopefully your imaginations have been running wild. I've classified here 4 major connection points that we think have got real application and in fact are emerging as applications in a government and public sector context. Individual transactions, management, benefits delivery, taxation, voting in certain jurisdictions already. This to business and NGOs, so delivery agent to government relationships. From a procurement perspective, yes, from a public-private partnership and infrastructure and capital sort of context, but increasingly through a direct delivery, and with that in a moment. Government, so I sit here this morning in Canada. Federalism is a major issue for us, but almost all governments have degrees of government transfers to provincial governments make transfers to municipal governments, and so forth. Many of those government-to-government transactions are in play. And the point from the PFM perspective is we actually think that there is a core foundation in blockchain technology to potentially help with public budgeting, financial accountability, and of course underpins all of government action. Specifically about PFM for a moment here. Again, you heard my comments in the discussion that I had with Paul Brody earlier. The driving factor for us is not just about better financial management, but through better financial management to better service provision and overall context of better government, however one defines that. Really was the driving foundation, the driving why we have made significant investments in this application. The 3 points there, and I'm not going to read those to you specifically. They are about essentially a fairly simple but quite difficult current ability to do 3 things. Understand how I spend my money, which is usually an appropriation of public accounts type structure, a transparency and accountability structure. That's spend my money on. How I spend my money is really about administrative efficiency, capacity from a delivery perspective, a productivity perspective. Again, I'd like to be able to connect the what I spend my money on to how I spend it. And then that I want to be able to do always is to demonstrate and did I achieve through my public expenditure. And that really leads to the notion of integrating financial and non-financial performance information. And so the foundation that we're trying to address here is to help public managers, to help service delivery agents, and so forth, to her understanding a better capability to manage what we spend public money on, how we spend it, and what delivers for our citizens. So the opportunity then lies nested in there. There's not just an administrative efficiency, but I actually think the creation of a better platform upon which to make applicative decisions. And so you get single sources of truth, yes, but you get real-time or very, very close to real-time decision-making information that at any point along a chain should help public managers to be effective. That drives across the system. It applies to all users, so everybody should have an advantage here. Again, as you're going to see in a moment, whether central budget authority or whether I'm the end game service delivery agent, everybody should have a great ability to exchange and to manage financial and non-financial conditions for public expenditure. There is one of the very, very core foundations of blockchain is a very high degree of confidentiality and security. We build these in private blockchain settings. At some point in the future, they may be public, but at the moment it's private, so very highly secure. Opportunity through the smart contracts to be able to code a variety of different controls, conditions, performance expectations, and so forth, which add to the richness of that integrated financial and non-financial perspective. The last point is that it defines user accessibility in a way that allows me to maintain the privacy, the autonomy of actors up and down the line. So this is not, in a sense, an attempt to centralize control. In fact, not at all. It's about enabling autonomy of appropriate accountable entities along a public delivery chain to maintain that, but at the same time to have a great level of information exchange and basis for improving service delivery. Use case. Context, the high-level stylized context here, is when we're trying to support effective decision-making to reduce cost and to improve transparency and accountability across these interagency or inter-entity divisions between a central budget authority, an aligned ministry, a policy or a program ministry or department, and business delivery agents. So what we built is a highly configurable blockchain solution that is essentially to apply for any condition when not that type of interface, and very importantly, for when trying to deliver specific outcomes that achieve over time a set of public objectives, a set of government outcomes. The current context, we know that we have got a challenge with regards to decision-making information, costly information exchange, sufficient transparent accountability. And this path forward would be one that a relatively inexpensive, very powerful, and quite easy to manage way would deal with this. One of the challenges is overcoming the information, the data management, and so forth divides that exist across these interfaces. As we get next, what we're trying here is that the blockchain sort of floats, if you will, alongside on top of the E and other enterprise systems at any of these levels. And it's that layer, that blockchain layer, that allows us to, from an information management perspective, add considerable detail. In real time, we have efficient exchange of financial and non-financial information. It allows us to have an integrated view of performance across the entire blockchain. So if I'm central budget authority, I'm now increasingly confident about how the appropriation structure is actually being accounted for and consumed. If I'm a program ministry or department, I have increasing confidence in my ability to demonstrate the policy objectives are being met, and the confidence in both the efficiency and the effectiveness of the way that I allocate money. If I'm down at the delivery agent end, increasing confidence again, I am meeting the performance targets that are expected of me, and that I'm doing so in an efficient financial manner. So the use case that we built was of an education system. Why? Because essentially every jurisdiction in the world has got an education system. Said it could have been built to talk about justice systems or health systems or transport system, transit authorities, etc. The point of it is that the basic story here is consistent. Specific application will have detail, of course, but what I'm trying to show here is that there is a configurable way of explaining and managing the information that gets exchanged, the expectations that get exchanged across, in this case, from a treasury board that manages government appropriations, through a tree of education, through different program structures, different actual delivery structures, and increasingly those delivery structures are outside of the direct control of government. And I'm still spending public money. I still have an expectation of being able to achieve the outputs. And I would have comprehensive, coherent, real-time information of what's going on. So that's the challenge that we addressed. As we move next, a little bit here about the technical architecture. Again, what we're essentially showing, and this is a working blockchain solution. It's a little difficult to see, of course, because the software itself is what is dealing with the in particular case, the tracking of an appropriation structure, the reporting back of performance metrics, and so forth. But the power is that we can have real-time information at any point who's got access along that node on the blockchain. And again, helping to answer three questions reliably. What is being spent on? How being spent from a productivity and efficiency perspective? And what outputs are delivered and what outcomes are being achieved. Here, for anybody who sits in a CIO's office or anything like that, this is again a very high-level view of the actual architecture. The thing to take away from this is the blockchain. In this particular case, we use an Azure platform. Again, one of the reasons why we do that is because Microsoft is one of the entities that has dealt with national data privacy and patriation regulations, certainly in places like Canada, the United States, etc. I think all jurisdictions globally, this is a very appropriate concern. Microsoft and their cloud platform is one of the entities that is able, one of the solutions that is able to deal with that. So to make sure that any of the applications that we are building are completely consistent with those expectations of governments. But the thing away from this is that the service layer, the blockchain layer, they sit on top of, they can run to, or certainly extract data from the underlying systems, but they have to, they require foundational change to those underlying systems, which reduces risk, greatly reduces cost, improves the flexibility of making changes in the future. Concept, and again, this is something that is consistent for blockchain applications, but something in a public financial management perspective is very important, and I would submit to you increasingly important. When we have call them horizontal programs, right? Education ministry, a healthcare ministry, some other ministry, they're co-investing in programs that are trying to achieve common objective by leveraging their individual authorities at law, and in terms of funding. Well, that creates, to many, many to one to many, etc. Relationships. Again, in the traditional sense of today's ERP systems and so forth, very difficult to be able to model and manage to report in real time about those sorts of transactions. In the text, much easier, and in fact, it is one of the core advantages. Okay, so as we move now into the last stage, and hopefully we're able to stimulate some questions, I'm going to end with 5 or 6 questions here about where we think it's in the government and public sector context, anything like PFM chain or whatever it is that we'll call it, applied is being considered. We recognize that the world is moving exceptionally quickly. Well past the concept stage. We are, in fact, deep to the proof of concept stage. It's hard to imagine that a government world hasn't already thought about this. Most, if not significant numbers, are moving into pilots. But the full industrialization of this is going to happen almost exponentially and very, very quickly. There's some interesting questions then I think need to be addressed. These aren't necessarily risks or challenges, but rather additional considerations that speak to the potential power and promise of blockchain. For order, what I've here is, and I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the power of let's call it the financial statement audit basis in a blockchain world. Our supreme audit institutions respond to this. It's a very interesting question. I think that the answer is that it ought very strongly to enhance their capabilities. Most supreme audit institutions do more than just financial statement audits. They also look to do value for money assessments and so forth. So particularly in the way that we've described it here this morning, ought to be a very powerful contributor to that. Is how global accounting standards bodies think about the blockchain, and I was speaking to one of the consultative advisory groups of the IPSAS board, roughly speaking, a week ago, maybe about 10 days ago, and a fascinating conversation. One of the things that was raised there by one of the consultative advisory group members was that in particular, as they promote, say, the move from cash to accrual accounting standard, as an example, chain world, you in fact be able to model quite easily and certainly quite effectively how the fiscal position, how a set of accounts would actually change under a cash versus an accrual perspective. If there are few changes about particular standards, could we model using blockchain what the implication of that is prior to actually setting the new standard? It wasn't something that I had thought of, but and hopefully you can see this, that would be a very powerful application, and one, in fact, that might be relevant in things like machinery of government changes, in moving to horizontal funding as opposed to traditional sort of vertical funding of public programs and so on. The third is how will governments embrace the move from private to public chains? The third there is whether or not, and this is going to happen in a relatively quick period of time, public blockchains to do private business on public chains. If that is yes, then there's probably two questions. The first one is, does that matter to governments from a service delivery perspective, and sort of the context that we've been presenting here this morning, and or does what think about from an overall commercial regulatory and commercial legislative perspective in terms of being able to deal with different forms of change in markets, different forms of transfer of value, and so forth. The fourth is how quickly will we introduce digitization of fiat currency into the equation. So there on, I mentioned that we are not dealing with cryptocurrency. In this context, for sure we are not. What we are starting to think about very quickly, a move to putting fiat currency into a digital form that can be tokenized and used in the blockchain context. And there are many central banks around the world that are thinking about this, but into the prospect of things like, putting, say, taxation nodes on the blockchain for payments of value-added taxes, for instance. Having a digital form of fiat currency legal will make such a situation ever more powerful. The fifth question is, what is the role of government as we shift from notarization to tokenization on the blockchain? So again, there's certainly some of the early moving applications of blockchain have all been around certification or notarizing particular conditions, either identity or conditions of certification, say of licensing, or I've got a degree, or I've got whatever that is, right? And I want to be able to prove that it's been that degree has, let's say, been conferred by an educational institution. Powerful, but extension and the more powerful application, and the one that we've spoken about here this morning, is about tokenization, and that's really about putting assets with real value onto the blockchain. Tokenization allows us to do that, but it also allows us to add non-financial conditions to the way that those financial tokens are traded, are exchanged, used in blockchain context. And again, I think that the most powerful applications in a government and public sector context are going to be those. Tokenization perhaps, but tokenization is where the future lies. And then the one that I will close with is really about how disruptive blockchain is going to be. How quickly is this really truly going to take off? Does anybody guess? Guess is it'll probably move more quickly than we can ever anticipate. As we move away from sort of parallel-based audit systems to ones integrated with laws, integrated with regulations, that smart contract, that transference of non-financial to financial, what are the applications going to be? Can I move an entire regulatory system onto the blockchain? Can I change the nature of delivery models so that individuals have got more autonomy and more choice in the way they consume public services? Those are questions are the ones that we think people are starting to think about, and for which blockchain will help at least provide answers very neatly in the future. So I'm going to hand it back to you. Hopefully people have found that interesting. Very happy to answer questions both on the webinar, and if there are any others to follow up, happy to do that as well.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was extremely interesting. We've been having questions while you've been talking, and they're still coming through. I start with the first, a more forward one, just to reiterate, I think, some of the things you said. But why does government need blockchain when everyone trusts government, don't they?
That's a very good question. I don't think in this particular case it is so much about trust in that context. More about the ability for blockchain to greatly reduce the cost of information exchange, and through that, to greatly enhance the ability of improving, again, I called it both the administrative and the allocative efficiency of public expenditure. So what does that mean? It means that I can trust you, but now at an information exchange which is in real time, very, very close to being in absolute real time, my exchange with you as a citizen or you as a consumer of my public service is much more immediate in that, or can be much more immediate in that context. While I trust the government to enhance the efficiency of those exchanges, to enhance the efficiency of the decision-making information and so forth, is where I think the actual power is.
Thank you. I'm going to group two questions together around security. One is, why are private blockchains more secure than public ones? And is how blockchain pass information governance for sensitive personal data, e.g. patients' medical records, share with different providers?
Both very good questions, and let me deal with the first one first. In public chains, essentially, the notion of what they call proof of work, in terms of how do you actually prove a transaction is valid, and it gets registered and so forth. A private chain, and the one that we certainly build in, so we tend to use Ethereum as our open source quorum and so forth. We've come up with what we call a proof of authority mechanism, and again, it's kind of tied to the first question around trust. Well, the corollary to a trust issue is who actually at law, and in the government context this is very important, who at law has got the authority to act on behalf of the public, right, or behalf of the government. And so using a proof of authority mechanism in a private chain allows two things to happen. One, I maintain my legal responsibilities very clearly and powerfully. And the second thing is I don't have to do any of that proof of work, those sorts of algorithms doing the math, as it were, to register. I can do that in a much more efficient way, as I have a permission-based system as to who my nodes are, etc., right? So I have a much higher degree of confidence. And private chain is actually, in terms of time of transaction, the ease of transaction, and so on, is actually a much more effective basis. So that's the answer to the first question. The answer to the second question is around individual privacy. Really, really important question, and I think you said it in terms of the health record. Well, there's a notion, and I would encourage people to kind of do some web-based search around this. There's a notion of self-sovereignty is potentially, again, one of the most powerful applications of blockchain. And that is that I own my data, and I own the conditions under which I might exchange the necessary bits of information, context with which I want to engage you. So in text, I don't necessarily need to say, for instance, reveal where I live, what my name is, whatever. But I might want very much to control dimensions of my health history. Why? Because that's something that will prove to be very valuable to the doctor who is treating a particular event, right? In the context of, a driver's license, or in a real property transaction, right, where I'm registering a property. I need to know that I'm the individual, I'm the one who owns that property. I don't necessarily need to reveal anything else about my personal identity to make the exchange. And to appropriately, to do that quickly, obviously, but to do that legally, right? So that notion of self-sovereignty, we think, actually enhances the ability for people to protect their own privacy. It's something that is certainly being seen in the early applications of blockchain, and something that will, I think, become ever more important as these applications continue to build.
Okay, I've got another question. Is this a permission-based private infrastructure? Follow on from that question is, what is the current performance of the use case, i.e. how many organizations, how many transactions, how many users?
So the answer to the first question is it is a private permission-based infrastructure, and the number of users, the difference in the applications, etc., depends on the specific text within which it's being applied. In certain cases, at the moment, it kind of goes back to something that's even on this page here. Most governments, at least at the moment, government and public sector space, are starting to work with some notarization examples, right? Starting to work. Estonia is an example where they're well ahead, and that's a legendary and very positive story. They moved, for instance, some of their AT and reconciliations onto the blockchain. These contexts within which there are millions of transactions that are taking place over a period of time, and so the scalability of this, again, is something that's very, very powerful. In the context of the announcement, again, that Paul Brody made at the end of last week, the private sector case has, we think, become the largest transaction volume application currently in operation in a real business context. And so, conditions of scalability, I think, have been dealt with. And again, we're quite confident in the ability of blockchain solutions to support the volume of transactions that governments typically deal with.
That leads actually quite well on to our next question, which is, do you feel that blockchain will be applicable to manage large data sets? But I think there's a specific example in mind here, because they then say, for example, in a pension environment, to manage data flow between government departments, HR, and administrators with accurate oversight.
I mean, short answer is yes. And in fact, in a context of when you would have and digital identity, digital wallets are what people talk about, and if digitized fiat currency, you could actually see very, very quickly that a public benefits payment mechanism, a public benefits system, a public pension system, etc., could move very quickly onto blockchain to actually be able to deal with all various payments and so forth. And that would, we think that that's very legitimately one of the most powerful future applications that we're going to see emerge. There's inherent demand of that question, which is around, I think the question was asked, or the phrase was put, do I have to move all of that data onto the blockchain? And the answer is you don't. Again, I think that's one of the important things to think about. What the blockchain can do is it sits on top of that underlying data area. And the blockchain can make the connection points between, I think the question said, I've got a pen database, maybe I've got an HR database for, let's say, public servants, I've got whatever conditions are. And
can it manage the data flow between those?
Precisely. And so that's exactly what takes place in the blockchain layer. The blockchain layer for a particular transaction would draw necessary data from those different places. The business conduct the exchange, finalize the transfer, whatever that is. Obviously, that's there forever. With actually, it's done through an API interface interface. It's done through an interface between the blockchain layer and the underlying data layer. It's a very, very powerful thing. Quite often in today's world, one of the first things that one has to do is have to, combine data sets, and that's very difficult. It's very challenging. Can be very, very expensive. One of the things that we think blockchain is going to prove very, very quickly is ability to move quite quickly past that. Actually, it's all like that intermediary step doesn't have to take place because I can just write the code in the blockchain such that it can deal with as many distributed data sources as we have.
Okay. There's a question around moving to the future, even beyond the realms of finance. Can you give real examples of tokenization with non-financial conditions already in use in the public sector?
Well, the closest is, in fact, the canalized example that we gave. The one I'm thinking of is actually not in an education setting, but let's just use the education setting as the one that we're thinking about here. And it's in the context of a capital expenditure. And so the capital expenditure has a set of expectations about the asset that is going to be created, like literally physically built to a particular standard, and a complicated asset that will take an extended period of time to actually physically build. But a step along the way, there are both payments and let's call them engineering conditions that need to be reconciled so that the condition is met before payment can be transferred. Some of those payment mechanisms, a high degree of complexity. There can be private equity investors in that, there can be money in play, and so forth. And complicated reconciliations, in some respect, not the financial conditions and so forth, actually to the physical condition of the asset. So independent engineers, et cetera. So what's happening in that particular case is that the funding, the payment is tied to the execution of a non-financial, has financial and economic value, of course, but to a non-financial condition. And the payment is only, let's call it made or released, when non-financial condition is satisfied. That's a combination, if you will, of the certification from an independent engineer that a particular bit of asset has met an engineering standard, tied to the financial transaction that's in play.
Got a few minutes. So, to what extent have alternative centralized or decentralized architectures been explored for that particular use case? What was then the tipping point, a single key decision factor in favor of blockchain?
Well, the key there really is the ease with which blockchain can deal with complexity across these interfaces of entities that I might control versus those that I don't. And that really is the tipping point. And so what we first of all hypothesized when we start to build this, and I kind of told that story, but now seeing as we develop not the proof of concept but the pilots, and we're starting to get it into real application, is that it's twofold. It's ability to integrate the financial and the non-financial, as I've just spoken about. But just as importantly, it's my ability to run, a reconciliation, a consolidation, a financial reporting, non-financial reporting, etc., across an organizational interface where it might be my line system, your agent. I have got no control over your financial reporting structure and so forth. I don't need to have that in the blockchain world. So a very much more powerful basis for exchange. The intention is and it depends very much on whatever jurisdictions framework it is that we're talking about. There's been time move over 20, 30 years to move common charts of accounts, to move to single ERPs across governments and so forth. What blockchain does is to deal with the interfaces between ERPs very, very effectively. That's why, if there's a tipping point, if you will, but it's more a tipping point, it's actually one of the foundational powers of it. That's really why we choose blockchain as opposed to anything else.
Okay, we have more questions, but I think with time we'll to address these at a later stage, and we'll be sure to get back in touch with the participants that have asked those specific questions. I think, Mark, if you would like to make some final comments.
I'm very happy to do so. It's again to thank people for their participation, for their interest. We are very committed to seeing what the power of this technology means. As I've said, I think a number of times, this is about the betterment of public service delivery, ultimately better government, and that's why we're committed to doing that. And we're just so excited about the potential for the technology. Early days, of course, but I think most pundits out there anyway are just talking about the potential power of this. It's very exciting to share some early perspectives on that, and just thank people.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. And I will just add that the presentation and a video will be circulated after the event, and we'll be in touch with some summaries and other recordings of the seminar for further use and viewing demand. In the meantime, if you have any further queries, please do not hesitate to contact myself or Mark with any more queries. So thank you very much to Mark McDonald at EY for that very insightful presentation, and thank you to all our participants for attending today. Very big numbers, and goodbye.